It is so good to be together with all of you this morning. Hope you are enjoying your Memorial Day weekend. Man, I'm glad that we get to spend Memorial Day weekend together. This is just so good. And I'm really excited to be continuing this series that we've been in looking at the book of Genesis, okay? If you've been with us, you know that really this series is all about the story of redemption. Okay, the story of redemption, that beyond all the nerdy debates about the age of the earth or like the scope of the great flood and all these different things that people love to like nerd out about, is really just a simple story about a God that will not give up. Okay, that even when all seems lost and when people seem beyond hope, that God finds a way to redeem the creation that he loves so much. That is the story of Genesis. But if you've ever like sat down and read the book of Genesis like for yourself on your own, you know that it doesn't always read that way, right? Like that message doesn't always jump off the page for you right out of the gate, right? Because even though the stories that are painted in Genesis are beautiful and cinematic and all this stuff, they're also really old and really, really messy. Unlike the movies that we watch that go down smooth and make us feel all like warm and toasty inside, Genesis often does the opposite, right? Can leave us feeling unsettled, confused. Sometimes we ask questions like, why would God want to redeem these people? Or why would God act in this specific way? Like, why is this story so messy? And honestly, I think the reason for that is because it is a true story. It's a true story. Genesis doesn't feel like a Hollywood movie because it's not trying to be one. It is trying to address real-world issues. And as you know, real-world issues and problems are not always easily solved, right? They can be very complicated. And so at times they require solutions that are even more complicated. And that is what we see all throughout the pages of this redemption story. That God's thoughts are not our thoughts, and his ways are not our ways. And that is really good news for us because time and again, we've proven that our ways just aren't enough to get the job done. That we simply cannot clean up all of the messes in our lives alone. We need to believe the gospel, okay? Tim Keller, who passed away recently, was arguably one of the greatest Christian thinkers of the last century, maybe just thinkers in general. He said, the gospel is this: we're more sinful and flawed in ourselves than we ever dared believe. Yet at the very same time, we're more loved and accepted in Jesus Christ than we ever dared hope. And today I want to suggest that is the message of Genesis. That it's essentially a gospel origin story. And as we continue to read it together today, it's our hope that if you've ever been discouraged by all the mess in the world and the mess in your life, and you've ever doubted God's presence or even doubted his existence, our hope is that you'd be reminded that that's just how God works. God works in the mess. He always has, and he still is. And so our big idea today is that God is still working to redeem the world, even in our messiest situations. And what we're going to do is we're just going to read through a really messy situation in the Bible, and we're going to pull out a few ways that God works on our behalf, even in the mess. So if you want to take out a Bible, you can at this point, and you can meet me in Genesis 16. So we're going to be rewinding a little bit from where we ended last week, but then we'll go beyond it in the end. If you couldn't make it last week, quick recap. We've been talking about Abraham and Sarah, all right? And Abraham and Sarah were chosen by God to be a blessing to all nations. God had promised them that they'd have children and that their descendants would be as numerous as the stars. But as time went on and on and on, it was harder and harder and harder for them to believe that was actually going to happen. So eventually, when Abraham was 86 years old, they decide enough is enough. We're going to take matters into our own hands. And so Sarah suggests that Abraham should take her servant girl named Hagar, and he should sleep with her and get her pregnant, which is obviously a terrible idea. But Abraham is like, sure, that sounds great, honey. Best idea you've ever had, in his own words, okay? And so that happens. Okay, and he gets Hagar pregnant, and as you might expect, drama and dysfunction ensues. There's pride and superiority that rises up in Hagar because she's pregnant now. And then there's bitterness and jealousy that rises up in Sarah. It's a complete mess. And we're going to pick up there right in the middle of it. Genesis 16, starting in verse 5. It says, Then Sarai said to Abram, their names will change to Sarah and Abraham later. Sarai said to Abram, You are responsible for the wrong I'm suffering. I put my slave in your arms, and now that she knows she's pregnant, she despises me. May the Lord judge between you and me. Your slave is in your hands, Abram said. Do whatever you think is best. Then Sarai mistreated Hagar, so she fled from her. The angel of the Lord found Hagar near a spring in the desert. It is the spring that is beside the road to Shur. And he said, Hagar, slave of Sarai, where have you come from and where are you going? I'm running away from my mistress Sarai, she answered. Then the Lord told her, Go back to your mistress and submit to her. The angel added, I will increase your descendants so much that they will be too numerous to count. And he also said, You are now pregnant, and you will give birth to a son, and you shall name him Ishmael, for the Lord has heard of your misery. And I'll stop right there. Talk about a messy situation. I mean, there's a whole lot going on there. There's infidelity, jealousy, blame shifting, all resulting in the mistreatment of this girl Hagar, who's already a slave. I mean, it's a mess. Now, quick sidebar. Whenever the Bible mentions slavery like this, it's important for us to understand that it's not endorsing or condoning this, obviously, right? Sometimes Bible critics like to point to things like this and suggest, the Bible is pro-slavery. Look, God sends Hagar back to submit to Sarah. It must be a pro-slavery book, but the reality could not be more different. As we continue to read, you'll eventually find out that God's directions here will eventually result in Hagar's official liberation. Okay, so rather than being a runaway slave in the desert, she'll eventually be fully liberated in a way that she had never expected. And there's other similar stories in the Bible, like in the book of Philemon, something similar happens, and just tons of examples where God is seeking to liberate people, to set captives free. So no, the Bible is definitely not a pro-slavery book, but it definitely does record slavery as a cultural reality. Okay, and the real truth is that wherever slavery is documented like this in the scriptures, so is dysfunction and chaos and misery. All right, and so getting back to the point, that is exactly what we find here. We find misery. Okay, misery that has been caused by the very people who were meant to be a blessing to the world, right? Sarah and Abraham were supposed to bless all nations, yet here we see them cause this terrible situation for this young girl, Hagar. And as I watch this, it breaks my heart because I just can't help but be reminded of the state of our world today. I think about all the abuse and the scandals and the things we read about in the news. And the sad reality is that sometimes the villains in these stories are not people that you'd expect. They're our role models, mentors, teachers, church leaders, pastors. People who are meant to bring hope into the world can instead bring about misery. And I think the temptation can be to write all that off as media bias, but I think the better approach is to just take it as it comes, right? The Bible doesn't get defensive about this when it's happening with Abraham and Sarah, so we shouldn't either. People are messy, and sometimes even the best of us can fail and do terrible things. And so instead of getting defensive in the mess, what we need to do is we need to cry out to God in the midst of it. Because here's the thing, there is still hope in the midst of every mess. There's hope for those who've been abused, hope for those who've been neglected, hope for the ones who've been wrongly accused as well, whatever. There is hope. Because it's like this passage says, the Lord has heard of your misery. The Lord has heard you. Those words should serve both to comfort those who've been hurt and also to warn those who've caused the hurt. The Lord hears. All right, and so the first way I want to point out that God works in the mess is just that he hears our cries. All right, God hears our cries from the mess. And we need to know that that's true because when we really believe that in our hearts, It's just like Hagar here. We can have confidence to move forward, even if God is calling us to continue to endure a difficult situation for a time. We can trust that he hears our cries. Keep crying out to him. Keep crying out to people that you trust. That is what Hagar does. Let's jump back in and keep reading. So at this point, Hagar does head back to Sarah, and she decides to name her son Ishmael, which means God hears. Very fitting, okay? And so then she gives birth to Ishmael, and then 14 years pass. A whole lot of time passes, and the Lord begins to work in the lives of Sarah and Abraham. And we talked a lot about that last week. You can go and watch that sermon to see what God does in their lives. But long story short, he's really gracious to them. He keeps his promise to them. When they're 100 years old, they give birth to their son Isaac. And now flipping over to chapter 21, verse 8, we'll read about what happens. It says, "The child grew and was weaned. And on the day Isaac was weaned, Abraham held a great feast. But Sarah saw that the son whom Hagar the Egyptian had borne to Abraham was mocking. And she said to Abraham, 'Get rid of that slave woman and her son, for that woman's son will never share in the inheritance with my son Isaac.' The matter distressed Abraham greatly because it concerned his son. But God said to him, 'Do not be so distressed about the boy and your slave woman. Listen to whatever Sarah tells you, because it is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned.' But get this, verse 13, 'I will make the son of the slave into a nation also, because he is your offspring.'" And we'll stop there. Another messy situation. Another situation that we for sure need to unpack, all right? We see here that little Isaac is growing. It says that he's weaning, which in this culture would have meant that he was about 2 or 3 years old. And so his parents throw this big party to celebrate, but of course, there's drama, right? Ishmael is there, and at this point, he's actually about 16 years old because so much his time has passed. Okay, and he starts teasing young Isaac. You've got a 16-year-old picking on a young 2 or 3-year-old, okay? And so Sarah sees this. She goes full on mama bear and is like, "Get that kid out of here." All right, and Abraham is just torn because he cares and loves both of these kids deeply. And now it's really interesting to watch what happens here, because then God speaks to Abraham, and the advice that he gives might not be what you'd expect. It's like, really, God, you're going to side with Sarah in this situation? You're going to tell him to, like, why would you do that? And so it's important for us to know that there is more going on here than meets the eye. Okay, and the way for us to actually understand that is to flip over to Galatians 4. Now, we don't have time to study that whole passage together, but I would totally recommend you read that on your own. But in essence, what it says is that these 2 boys represent 2 different covenants, 2 different ways of life. All right, Isaac represents a life of trusting God's promises, and Ishmael represented a life of going your own way, trusting God's way, going your own way, trusting God or trusting self. You can't do both, right? Those 2 things don't mix. And so even though Abraham loved both of these boys deeply, the 2 of them were simply headed in different directions. And so God speaks and says, you need to let this happen, right? You need to listen to Sarah and send off both Ishmael and Hagar, even though this is going to be really, really hard. Now, this is hard for us to imagine, but it really does, if you think about this, in light of what we read or what I shared in Galatians, this really does apply to our lives as well, right? Sometimes on our spiritual journey, we come to these moments in life where, like Abraham, we have to choose between one way of life and another, maybe one group of friends and another. And sometimes it can be a really difficult decision when we have to draw the line in the sand on an issue. You have some close friends, but they're walking in a direction all of a sudden that you know God is not calling you to walk in. And so you could either go along with them and try to make the best of it, or every once in a while, we come to these situations where you have to kind of pull away for a season and let God work. I remember early on as a college student, I decided I was going to start kind of trying to live out my faith more consistently. And I was with a group of friends who weren't at that same point in life. and we were just hanging out together. We're trying to decide what movie to watch, and I remember they picked out this movie that was just like a filthy movie, like really inappropriate, and I was like, I'm not in a spot where I want to like put this in myself. I don't want to watch this. And so I'm struggling because I don't want to be judgy and all this stuff, but I bring it up to them. I'm like, guys, I know this is awkward. Can we watch something else? And it did not go well, okay? They made fun of me. They teased me. It was like this situation, right, with Isaac and Ishmael. It's like I was being mocked. And it got so bad that eventually I just had to leave. And it was totally awkward. I thought I had completely messed up the friendship. But you know what? It's funny. When I look back at that situation now, I can tell you that was a great decision, not just for me, but also for those friends. Because not only are we still friends to this day, but some of them have let me know that they respect me for actually living out what I believe and for not just going along with the crowd, okay? And others of them are actually believers today. And I think if we're honest, we have little opportunities like this all the time in life. Opportunities where there are minor disagreements and things like that where we need to separate ourselves and be a little more distinct. And then there's opportunities where there are major issues that come up. And we can feel a little bit like Abraham here, where we're caught between two lifestyles and we don't know what to do. And when we find ourselves there, we need to listen for the voice of God, because here's what I know. Point number 2. That God is able to work out those messes with grace and truth. That God is able to work those things out. We don't always know what the results of us being obedient to God will lead to, but God does. He can work it out. He cares about those people that you disagree with just as much as he cares for you. And even if your relationships are affected temporarily, it might lead to whatever's best for you and whatever is best for them. Now let's watch how it works out for Ishmael and Hagar. Spoiler alert, it gets a lot better, but it gets a whole lot worse before it gets a whole lot better, okay? So let's keep reading. Verse 14. It says, early the next morning, Abraham took some food and a skin of water and gave them to Hagar. He set them on her shoulders and sent her off with the boy. She went on her way and wandered in the desert of Beersheba. When the water in the skin was gone, she put the boy under one of the bushes. Then she went off and sat down about a bow shot away, for she thought, I cannot watch the boy die. And she sat there. She began to sob. God heard the boy crying, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, what is the matter, Hagar? Do not be afraid, for the Lord has heard the boy crying as he lies there. Lift up the boy and take him by the hand, for I will make him into a great nation. Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. So she went and filled the skin with water and gave the boy a drink. And God was with the boy as he grew up, and he lived in the desert and became an archer. And that's where we're going to end the narrative for today. And what I love about stopping here is that we finally have a sense of resolution, right? That Hagar and Ishmael are now free, and it says that God was with them, and we could finally breathe a sigh of relief. But obviously, it took a whole lot of time and a whole lot of difficulty to get there. Got a lot messier before it got any cleaner. See, Hagar and Ishmael had reached rock bottom. They were wandering in the desert, trying to fend for themselves. And eventually, they reach their limits. They're out of water. They're thirsty. And they're at this point where they are desperate. And in this moment, it gives us a glimpse of what Hagar is thinking. It says she thought, I cannot watch this boy die. She sat there and she began to sob. And I wonder if any of us here have ever felt this way spiritually. Have you ever had a moment where you have reached your breaking point over your spiritual condition or over the spiritual condition of someone that you know and you care about? Maybe you know somebody who's wandering through a desert in life. Maybe it's a friend or a relative, and you've just been watching them dry up more and more as they make bad decision after bad decision, and you have nothing to give them anymore. And you can't even bear to watch. Or maybe it's you that's been wandering, right? Maybe you've got this thirst in life and you're doing whatever you can to try to fill it up. You're doing things you never thought you would do in order to find this satisfaction, but nothing seems to be enough wherever you're at. We need to know that the solution may be closer than you think. See, there's a well that's available to all of us, a well that never runs dry. Jesus referred to himself as living water, okay? That's why we call our church H2O, because we believe the living water, Jesus, is the only one who can truly satisfy these deep spiritual thirsts that we all have. And just like God opened Hagar's eyes to this physical well that was nearby in this story, I think oftentimes in our lives, we need God to do the same thing for us spiritually. We need him to open our eyes to Jesus, or open our eyes to Jesus again. Because sometimes it is hard to sense him in the messy situations, but we need to know that he is there. He sees you. He may be closer than you think. And so my third and final point is that God draws near us in the mess. God is drawing near you in your mess. And we've all got messes, right? Whether we've caused them or whether someone else has caused them, or they're in the mess. And when that's going on, it can be so easy to hang our heads down and to just look away, to just give up, to think, man, this is the end for me, and this is the end for that person. Listen, it does not have to be the end, right? It doesn't have to be the end of the story. God hears us, he sees us, and he's near us. And even if we always can't see how he's working, he is working somehow to redeem the world, even to redeem your mess here today. And we can all believe that in faith, right? It's always been messy in this world. This was a really messy situation, but God was orchestrating behind the scenes to work. It's no different for us now. And so here's how I want to close. We're going to wrap up with a time of worship and communion, and I just want us to have some time just to remember that God is near today. That he gave his life to redeem us from all this mess that's happening. And even though you might not sense him, he is at work now. If you believe in him today, I'd invite you to just use this time to cry out to him, to believe that he actually hears you, to believe that he knows the complexity of your situation. I know the stuff that's happening in your lives is messy. To believe that God understands it and he can redeem it. So let's spend this time doing that. At any point during these last couple songs, you can go to the back, grab a communion cup, peel away the top, take the wafer, drink the juice, and just remember that he gave his life to us so that he could fill ours. He gave his life to us so that we would be filled. And he's going to redeem the mess in this world. Let me pray, and we'll spend some time just believing God for that.